Hi, everybody. So I'll be talking about a related topic, but here is actually an empirical study. So I'll be talking about how infants represent unseen objects when such objects are being named. And this work is co-authored with an undergraduate research assistant, Emily Yang, who was amazing, and my former postdoctoral mentor, Sandy Waxman, who asked me to say hi to all of you. So, hi. All right, so one thing that I'm pretty sure all of us are aware here is that language facilitates learning and communication. But the thing that amazes me most about it is that language helps us learn about things that we do not experience directly, such as historic figures, such as Marie Curie, remote places, other people's thoughts, and abstract ideas such as infinity. And this capacity is a hallmark of our species, and it shapes our cultural and educational practices, our clinical interventions. So clearly, this is really central to being human. Now, questions that I'm asking in this line of my research is, when does communication about the unseen develop, and how do infants represent the unseen? So a couple of remarks here. When I say unseen, I really mean perceptual and available in various ways. Doesn't have to be in a visual modality, untouched, unsmelled, et cetera, et cetera. And even though in this talk I'm focusing more on the second question, how do infants represent such entities, I also want to show you a little bit of evidence on the first question, because this study inspired the design of the one I really want to share with you. Okay, so when communication about the unseen develops? Well, so to answer this question, we recruited 15-month-old infants. Why 15-month-olds? It's because at this point, infants are known to understand something called absent reference. It means that they understand verbal reference to something they have seen in the past that's currently absent. And so now we're asking the next step is, can they learn something about something entirely unseen based on language without having prior exposure to it? And so here is the paradigm we used here. We had a speaker who had various objects pop up behind her back. This was done on a screen. So she would have something like an apple pop up behind her back and be like, oh, an apple, baby, do you see the apple? Oh, an orange, oh, a banana, okay? And then the fourth event happened where she looked back again, but this time she appeared to occlude the object with her body entirely, such that the infant never had visual access to the object. And she said, let's, a MODI. And I think this design was partly inspired by Anne Christoph's work, so I just want to credit her here. So what we predicted here is that if infants realized that, one, there is an object behind the person's back, that object must have something to do with fruits, because 3 times it did, and third, she is naming it, because 3 times she was, then they should realize that she is basically labeling something fruit-like. And when we get to the test phase, where we present one object, which is a unfamiliar-looking fruit, so we don't know if a lot of infants have experience with pitaya fruits, but even if they do, they typically don't know their names. And then we have a distractor object that matched on some perceptual properties, but comes from a different semantic neighborhood. Now, even though this is old news, a bit of a suspense, so can our 15-month-olds do that? Which means, will they look at this fruit-like object when we say, can we find the MODI, which is the word that we taught them during this episode? So can they do that? Well, yes, they can. The condition I just presented you with, we called it semantic priming because we primed a particular semantic neighborhood. And so infants in this condition actually prefer to look to the object that appears to be a fruit. So their looking here is significantly above the chance level. Moreover, we had a couple of control conditions to rule out alternative explanations here. So one possibility is that perhaps infants would be preferring to look at the fruit for reasons unrelated to our manipulation, for example, because it's edible. By the way, we had other categories as well. We had vehicles, animals, and household items, I believe. So it's not about the category. But we just wanted to make sure that our target objects are not intrinsically more preferred by infants. And so to address this concern, we had a condition in which instead of showing an orange, an apple, and a banana, we had 3 unrelated objects like a hat, a dog, and a spatula. And then no particular semantic neighborhood was primed, so infants shouldn't have a preference in this case. And this is what we actually found. So there's also a significant difference between our main condition of interest and this control. And we had another control condition which addressed the possibility that we simply really activated the semantic neighborhood without necessarily infants mapping the representation of an unseen object to a word. To address that possibility, we replaced the word during the test phase. So now we taught them the word Modi. We're saying, where is the blicket? And if it's just about activating a semantic neighborhood, there should be no difference between this condition and this next control, but it's not the case. Actually, when we switched the word, infants looked to the target just at the chance level, and there was a significant difference. Now, this is old news. I actually presented these data at this conference, but just in case this is not familiar, I want to explain the core features of this design. And so this particular study shows us that 15-month-olds succeed at forming a representation of something that's unseen based on priming. They are able to link it to a novel word during labeling, so they're able to comprehend the idea that something unseen can be labeled. And they're succeeding at identifying the referent object by the time it becomes visible. Okay, now when I presented these data at this conference and several other conferences, a lot of people started wondering, well, what do infants actually represent about the unseen? And this inspired the design of the study I'm going to share with you now. By the way, what I want to also mention is that we started with 15-month-olds, right, because I mentioned they comprehend absent reference. We didn't stop there. We also tested younger than 15. And infants at that point are not quite capable of the same yet. So when we designed the next study, we also went with 15-month-olds and older. So here we tested a bunch of infants from 15 to 18 months. So on average, they were around 17 months. Also a study done online on Lookit. And we manipulated 3 variables this time. So first was the priming mode. So we either used the same priming as I just showed you, where it was both visual and lexical. We've shown the objects and we labeled the objects. Or the priming was only lexical. That was one of the questions people asked me. What if you just showed them so much visual data that you biased their performance? So we decided to make it a variable. The second is the breadth of the primed category. Right, we picked a fairly arbitrary set of objects for the priming in the study I've shown you, but it really remains a question whether infants are informed by the variety of things that we show them during priming. And so here we had broad versus narrow category priming with regard to the visual features. And finally, we wanted to see what happens depending on the typicality of the target object at test. All right, when I showed you this previous study, we used a pitaya fruit, which is not atypical, at least, given the demographic that we were testing, this is not a typical exemplar of a fruit. And so we were wondering if that has actually any impact on how infants perform and how they represent, and whether their representation of the unseen object is broad enough to include typical and atypical exemplars of that category. So now you notice that I switched from saying semantic neighborhood to saying category, mostly because we tested somewhat younger infants. So with 15-month-olds, we are not sure they represent superordinate categories. With infants in this study, we have more evidence that they do have representation of superordinate categories. I feel a bit more comfortable saying it at the level of categorization. All right, so here's what I mean by visual and lexical versus lexical only priming. So here's one condition.
Hi, baby.
Oh, sorry. I need to make it audible for you. Hold on. I believe I need to switch the source. Oh, or here. Sound. Yeah? It's not possible? Ah, okay. Ah, okay, all right. Well, let's try this.
Hi, baby. Let me show you what I have here. Look, an apple. See the apple? Look, an orange. See the orange? Look, a plum. See the plum? Look, a blicket. That's a nice blicket. I like blickets.
Okay. And here is the alternative.
Hi, baby. Let's see what I have here. Wow, an apple. I've got an apple.
Okay, so you got the idea. So in the second condition, she just never shows the objects that she has in there, but she labels them. Now, broad versus narrow category priming, here is a couple of examples. What you have just seen in the video was narrow category priming. Again, from the visual perspective, these all are fruits that share perceptual properties, such as being round, having this little stem, and being approximately of the same size, at least based on the set that we've shown. And then we had a broad category priming where we had fruits that varied in size and shape and various other properties. It's, again, not just fruits. I'm giving you fruits as an example. Okay, finally, this is the manipulation of the exemplar. So when our target object was typical, it meant that it shared the perceptual properties that we emphasized during priming, especially in the narrow priming condition. So this is a mango. It's roundish, it's kind of smooth, it's red and yellow, it has this little stem. And then atypical, it's again a pitaya fruit, but not a yellow one, but the red one. So it's a little less typical. And again, this is just one example. We randomized the side, of course, of the target object, the color, sometimes they were yellow, both the target and the distractor, and the category itself was also randomized. So what we predicted here, so we thought, first, visual and lexical priming combined with typical typical exemplars during test, especially when we have narrow visual category priming, would yield stronger preferences for the target object because it would constrain infants' representation of that unseen object. And it will be easier to realize that the typical target object is a member of that category. But let's see what we find. Well, we actually see no significant differences across all manipulated variables, at least at the level of simple effects. In all conditions, we see a significant preference for the target object at test, which is great news. It's great news because it means that our original finding that I shared with you before was not a byproduct of just the selection of stimuli. So the finding is fairly robust with respect to variation. So to sum up here, there is no main effect of category breadth. It doesn't matter how we prime them. No main effect of the typicality of the target. There's no simple effects of the priming mode, but there is a main effect of the, sorry, not the, yes, the main effect of the priming mode, meaning lexical versus visual and lexical. And you can see, maybe you'll see it better on this graph, that actually infants performed a little better, but a little but significantly so, when we primed infants just with words. Now, that's not what we predicted. You know, we see that labels alone can be more effective. It can be because maybe when we do the priming, identifying familiar exemplars during priming somehow taxes infants' attention because we're giving them visual and lexical input. It could be that visual input somehow narrows representations, that the lack of visual input doesn't, it just activates the relevant category. But one way or another, what we are finding is that infants can form representations of unseen objects from linguistic input alone, okay? And those representations are broad enough to include typical and atypical exemplars of the prime category. And broadly speaking, it suggests to us that labels really contribute to the development of representational and referential capacities in infancy. I am still a little puzzled by this finding, so I'll be really happy for your input and your suggestions with regard to interpretation of these findings and also the design of future investigations. And with that, I thank everybody who was involved in this research, and I thank you for listening, and I welcome questions.